Greetings, NASSM colleagues. As the preeminent academic association for sport management, research, teaching, and service, NASSM has accepted the call to action to address racial inequities within its membership and in the field of study. The NASSM 2021 conference theme, Race Forward, Agents for Change in Sport Management, encourages sports scholars and educators to more fully explore our role advancing racial justice through our research, teaching, and practice. Throughout the conference, we encourage our colleagues to consider the ways race and racism affect sport management and our role in promoting a more socially just field. Given our conference theme of Race Forward and NASSM's call to advance racial justice through our research, teaching, and practice, it made sense this year for our keynote presentation to focus on meaningful ways in which we can support faculty of color in the workplace. Today, I had the honor of introducing the co-presenters of NASSM's 2021 keynote lecture entitled Agents for Change, a Call for Bold Leadership in the Recruitment and Retention of Sport Management Faculty of Color. This year's keynote co-presenters are Dr. Tamara Bertrand-Jones and Dr. Cameron Beatty. Dr. Tamara Bertrand-Jones currently serves as Associate Professor of Higher Education in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at Florida State University. Her research examines the sociocultural influences on socialization during graduate education and the professional experiences of underrepresented populations, particularly Black women, in academia. Her previous work as an administrator and program evaluator also influenced her other research interests in culturally responsive assessment and evaluation. Dr. Cameron Beatty is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at Florida State University. His research foci include exploring the intersections of gender and race and leadership education, leadership development of students of color on historically white college campuses, and understanding experiences of racial battle fatigue for Black and Latinx students. He is a scholar passionate about deconstructing race, systemic racism, and hegemonic masculinity in post-secondary education environments. Please join me in welcoming Tamara and Cameron to the NASSM community.
Thank you so much, Damon, for the invitation to share our thoughts on how NASSM as an organization and you as individual members can become agents for change and exhibit bold leadership in sport management. We appreciate the invitation.
We first want to share our departmental land acknowledgement. So before we start, we'd like to recognize that here in Tallahassee, we stand on the indigenous lands of the Appalachian Nation, the Muskogee Creek Nation, the Miccosukee Tribe of Florida, and the Seminole Tribe of Florida. As educators, it is important for us to acknowledge the violent and painful past that have allowed Florida State University to be. We also honor the history, knowledge, and the contributions of these tribes and their peoples as we share with you today. We encourage you to reflect on the lands on which you inhabit. We hope that you will take time to reflect on the lands you stand on and are joining us from.
Cameron and I thought a play on the theme Race Forward presented the perfect analogy for our talk today. In keeping with this theme, we're going to take a trip toward bold, transformative leadership. But before we head out, we have to discuss how we prepare for our journey. Our next step will be recruitment, where we'll talk about how to engage faculty of color. After that, our next step will be retention, where we'll discuss how to keep faculty of color. And as with any journey, we may encounter some potholes we have to avoid or roadblocks to navigate. And finally, we'll discuss how to arrive at our destination by examining what bold, transformative leadership looks like at both the individual and organizational levels. So buckle up, and I hope you're ready to engage in this journey with us.
As we prepare for the journey, we have to reflect on a few things. Where are we headed? What do we have for the trip? What transportation do we need? And what will you do when you arrive? So think about if you're getting in the car and the check engine light comes on, right? You feel some anxiety, like what's wrong with my car? Do we have the tools necessary to understand how to address the issue? Do we have the language when we think about this journey? what transportation specifically is needed and the resources for that transportation. And when we understand where we're headed, then we really think about the route to get there. And we want to offer some best practices when thinking about the route to get there. So the first is really thinking about these recruitment strategies or best practices specifically for faculty of color, but I also want to highlight graduate students because graduate students become faculty and become faculty of color. There are many resources, accessories, and things that we need to make the journey. And not all of our journeys are going to look the same or take the same routes or have the same end destination. So with these best practices from the literature that have addressed equity issues specifically for recruiting faculty of color and graduate students of color, we really want you to be thinking about your own institutions and your own contexts. Have you implemented any of these best practices? Where have you failed? Where have you not adopted? And what has kept you from adopting some of these best practices? And will any of them actually work in your context? And if you don't think they will, what will work? And thinking critically about that. So the first one is really thinking about intentional recruitment and admissions search processes. So when we think about our graduate students of color, oftentimes our programs are like, they're going to come to us, right? And then we look at our students, we look at the application pool, and we wonder why there might not be as diverse of an application pool. And we have to take some ownership in what it looks like to recruit graduate students, specifically of color. And then thinking about our faculty and search processes. What does intentional recruitment look like? How do we use our associations to think about a more broader recruitment strategy? How do we use our networks beyond our specific bubbles to think about where can we really gain a strong, diverse applicant pool? Another best practices that has been cited in the literature is really thinking about cluster hiring. And when we think about cluster hiring is how do we think about cohorts of faculty from marginalized identities coming in together so there's not just one or a token representative, so to speak, when thinking about that. And with this, we've found is a strong recruitment strategy that then lends itself to a strong retention strategy. This can also be thought about when you think about adopting this strategy with recruitment of graduate students in more cluster peer groups or really thinking about these cohort models. Mentoring programs are also recruitment best practice. So highlighting, okay, you come here and then what, right? So is there strong mentorship, a strong pipeline of mentorship specifically for faculty of color, and how do you highlight that through the recruitment process? Thinking about campus-wide diversity and inclusion, cultural competency training, oftentimes we have search processes, and oftentimes these search processes, we haven't really thought about what does it mean for diversity and inclusion within our search. Then how does that translate to diversity and inclusion efforts within our program, within our department? And thinking critically about does everyone have common language, and we'll talk about that a little later, and common understanding of what we're trying to get at through the recruitment process. Funding initiatives for retention is an opportunity to really highlight how a faculty might be supported when they come into our institutions, and thinking how do we offer that as a part of the recruitment process. And thinking about opportunities for growth, opportunities for leadership for marginalized faculty and students, and how do we highlight those opportunities within our particular programs if they exist? And if they don't exist, how do we create opportunities to really be intentional? And finally, really thinking about our institutions, our programs, how we engage in the scholarship of sports management does not happen in silos. They don't just come to our institution, to our program, to our department, but they come to our communities and what's happening in the surrounding community in which faculty of color and which graduate students are going to engage. We can have the most superb, most welcoming program, but as soon as they step outside of that bubble, what are we as faculty of color, graduate students engaging in that might be a hindrance to what they're actually experiencing within the program? And how do we really highlight opportunities for faculty of color to engage within the community as a recruitment strategy? With retention, it's really important to consider, do we know how faculty of color, how people of color, how graduate students are experiencing our particular programs, departments, colleges, schools, institutions? Or are we just assuming based on our own experiences what the experience of faculty of color are? Data is our friend. So how can data really inform our practice? So if people are saying they have a certain experience and we have data to show that, then how do we use that data to address on a more systemic way what the experience is? We do that by really thinking about the climate and assessing the climate. Really thinking about our own internal evaluation processes. Is it clear what the tenure and promotion expectations are? Is it clear what graduate students are expected to do from year to year as they progress through their program? And really understanding the marginalized experiences, specifically of graduate students, because faculty of color might have a certain experience that might not be the same as graduate students, and making sure that we're not lumping in everyone's experience based on their role, their positionality within the program or department. This reboot climate approach that Lawrenson and Austin highlight in Inside Higher Ed talks about really thinking about retention strategy of promoting a work-life balance, and how do we model that as leaders, whether that be a program chair, a department chair, an advisor. How do we think about work-life balance, and then how is that translated across the department? So it's not just an individual approach to work-life balance, but is there a collective approach, and we're going to hold each other accountable to what we mean by a work-life balance. Building collegial, respectful, non-hierarchical interactions. I'm going to pick on our wonderful Dean Damon and really talk about how he has modeled this for us in thinking about building relationships where it's not just we're having a conversation when it's time to evaluate you or go up for promotion and tenure, but I want to learn about you as a person. I want to learn about what you're interested in. I want to break down this hierarchical relationship that might exist that sets up a boundary within itself, but also sets up an opportunity to engage those that might feel marginalized within the space, within the community. And then sharing of department service, advising, teaching assignments. The literature tells us the faculty of color have an added tax when it comes to service, specifically of supporting students of color or supporting students that are interested in maybe researching equity and justice issues, of thinking about their teaching evaluations and how students respond to faculty of color in the classroom. So really thinking about what does it look like for fair sharing and supporting of advising and teaching. And then finally, actually calling out microaggressions when they happen in the moment, and heighten our own senses of them. We might hear something that wasn't a big deal for us, but we don't know how that impacted a colleague, and really thinking about how do we center and then name, call out, address, and then how do we move forward when thinking about microaggressions in the space. As we transition to roadblocks and potholes, we have these best practices that are really great ideas, but sometimes something stops us from enacting really great ideas. And as we transition to these, we think about these roadblocks and these potholes.
In our research with faculty, our work with and in institutions, and our own personal experiences with the topic, we know that despite the best of intentions, leaders experience these potholes that could sometimes lead to roadblocks if they're not addressed directly or timely. These roadblocks can cause irreparable damage to equity and inclusion efforts. So as we examine these roadblocks and potholes, I encourage you to think about solutions you would offer if you found yourself in this position on your road to change. Oftentimes, these high traffic areas need quick fixes so as not to stop or to hinder the flow of traffic too much. Sometimes potholes that have emerged in the road cause us to, we can be tripped up by these potholes. Too many potholes can cause the road to be blocked so that it can be repaired. But sometimes we try to rush those repairs with quick fixes that oftentimes don't stand the test of time. So we encourage you to think about these roadblocks, the potholes, how you can fix them so that the potholes don't continue to block the road towards change. So our first roadblock is, diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice, anti-racism are all synonyms. Unfortunately, or fortunately, each of these terms is distinct, yet we treat them synonymously. While they do in fact share an acknowledgement of difference, their use triggers different actions and signals to others unspoken commitments. So not understanding or being clear about our desired outcomes can cause leaders to stumble in pothole number one. And that is attempting to appease all while directly addressing nothing. So let's use an example that's pretty close to home for Damon, Cameron, and I. We have a university task force, and actually might not be just unique to Florida State University. We have a university task force on anti-racism, equity, and inclusion, all three terms. These terms have different meanings, and their trajectories for action have different starting and different ending points. So naming your university or college or department committee using these terms together creates a lack of clarity about the purpose of the group, along with a mixed bag of expectations. So if we wanted to hold the university accountable per se for the work of this task force, what would we measure? The name of the task force sends a message that we don't want to offend anyone. So let's try to appease everyone by throwing all of the diversity terms in the group's name. This comes across as disingenuous and inadvertently sends, for example, an all lives matter message when a Black Lives Matter cry is being lifted. What policy or university practices will truly change when there's such a lack of clarity or purpose? Because the university is attempting to appease all of our stakeholders, the university comes across as tone deaf and the intentions of the task force performative. So the work of the committee is fragmented, and then altogether increases the likelihood that committee members and others become disillusioned with the process. This leads us to roadblock number two, or the experience of potholes number 2 and 3. First is that diversity is difficult to address. This is a roadblock for sure that blocks our progress. Diversity being difficult is a roadblock that continues to pop up and thus makes diversity difficult to discuss. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy and also a crutch that folks use when they don't really want to talk about diversity or equity or inclusion or justice or fill in any of the other concepts we use to describe this work. Because these topics can spark discomfort and challenge our assumptions or values, and even some of our long-held beliefs, we try to steer far away from them. And unfortunately, this roadblock leads to a couple of potholes that continue to trouble leaders along the path. And pothole number 1 here is that we pretend that it does not exist, that diversity does not exist. As Cameron mentioned earlier, we might not talk to, data is important. And we don't talk to faculty or students of color about their experience as faculty or students of color. We don't ask the women faculty what it's like being a woman in the college or the department or the organization. If we don't bring it up, then the negative experiences don't happen. The second pothole inherent in this difficulty of diversity discussions is passing the buck. So passing the buck comes with a variety of excuses or even rationalizations. So oftentimes leaders pass the buck amongst each other. We often hear, well, the dean's office won't give us the money that we need to recruit competitively for diverse candidates in high demand. And then the deans say, well, our hands are tied if faculty search committees don't come back with diverse faculty candidates. And both are excuses that are sometimes grounded in myths like the weak or leaky pipeline, or the notion that diverse faculty are hard to find, or the myth that diversity requires a lowering of standards, which is far from the truth. And this actually leads us to roadblock number 3. In preparation for our talk today, we took a closer look at the NASSM organization. What caught our attention were the most popular articles in the Journal of Sport Management. Of the 20 articles listed on the website, 7 of them were related to diversity or social justice topics. 5 of those 7 were specifically focused on gender. So kudos to you as an organization and individual scholars for recognizing and continuing to push the conversation around sexism in sport. Even with this acknowledgement, I hope that you would agree with me that other topics are missing. Ability and race are 2 obvious topics that come to mind. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure that these topics are covered, have been, or are planning to be covered in the journal, but they have not risen to the top as gender has. Which leads us to this explanation of roadblock number 3, and that is assuming that all experiences or oppressions are the same. Oppression Olympics is when individuals try to outdo each other in proving the effects of oppression on various types of difference. For example, women suggesting that sexism is worse than racism. While this can be counterproductive, failing to acknowledge the distinctions of each type of oppression does not allow for us to examine the unique ways that race informs a faculty member's experience, nor does it account for the fact or for the impact of multiple oppressions, like those that women faculty of color or faculty of color with disabilities may experience. So because we assume that all experiences are the same, or we disregard the intersectionality of oppression. So pothole number 3 further exacerbates this roadblock. And as Cameron mentioned, data is key here, not disaggregating the data or even collecting data. So leaders often don't disaggregate the data. In many instances, we don't even have the data to disaggregate. So why is it important to disaggregate the data? Doing so allows us to identify the distinctions in experience and can be used as nudges or evidence of the need to dig deeper. Say, for example, as a leader, you are responsible for organizational or college level data, and a question about tenure and promotion successes comes up. The logical thing to do would be to ask, how many assistant professors or tenure track faculty have successfully been tenured in a specific time frame, right? The data can definitely tell you this. We've had X number of tenure track faculty and X number have received tenure within 6 years. So we have an X% success rate for tenure and promotion. We pat ourselves on the back and we keep moving, especially if the number is favorable. However, our solution of disaggregating the data allows us to see how many women, how many racially minoritized or other marginalized faculty have in fact received tenure. Disaggregating the data also allows for us to examine the intersections of gender and race, for example. Data can also prompt us to examine policies or procedures in place that support further inequities and undermine our equity efforts. These data also can point us to collect new data that further explains individuals' experiences of our environments. And all of this helps us to better understand the underlying issues so that we can address them and actually be agents of change.
So what are some solutions? How do we avoid these particular roadblocks? And as we know, unlearning oppression we will encounter, as Bell Hooks says, obstacles, rejection, conflict, pain. We need courageous leaders who are willing to lead the way. And we hope that's you. So in our next slide, we want to identify some ways that bold, transformative leaders like yourself can be the agents of change.
Our first step towards bold and transformative leadership is prioritizing or interrogating your own positionality. We want to make sure that we point out here that these steps are a combination of individual steps and organizational steps. So as we think about these, we want to encourage you to think about yourselves as individuals who are nested within different organizations or institutions. And then even within that, you're also nested or a part of the NASSM organization. So as individuals, a part of a diverse collective, our responsibility to better understand our stances and standpoints on a variety of issues might be clearer. Make sure that you are able to do the work of exploring how your own identity and histories of how the groups that you belong to have navigated the world and how this history influences our current day.
When we think about being willing to engage in difficult conversations, we have to think about that at the individual level and the organizational level. So, as individuals, we have to recognize that this work is hard and there is no finish line. We want to get our ribbon, we want to get our trophy because we have engaged, we have done the work, we have increased faculty of color, but really knowing that the work is really ongoing. And there are many times that we are going to be uncomfortable with difficult conversations, with difficult tasks, or with difficult experiences that have been brought to our attention. But if we are committed to being agents of change, we have to navigate that difficulty again and again. At the organizational level, we have to consider how we are engaging in difficult conversations that impact our field. What do our public statements say regarding our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice issues? How do we communicate as an organization that we are committed to this work in our field and beyond, even when it is difficult? With growth, we really want to highlight that discomfort equals growth. We learn the most when we are uncomfortable. If you really think about learning moments in your life and and how you came out of them, what you learned in those moments stay with you. And growth happens as we step into this discomfort and use it as an opportunity to learn and grow. As Maya Angelou told us, when we know better, we do better. So once it's been called, it's been brought to our attention, what do we do with that? How do we grow? How do we think about that as an organization? If we as an organization are committed to growth and issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, then what does that look like? And how do we really think about where the moments are going to be uncomfortable, this discomfort as an organization, and are we collectively committed to moving through that discomfort?
Mhm. I think this actually leads us right into our next step, is that we need to stop perpetuating the status quo. And our role as individuals in perpetuating the status quo can be much clearer than the role of the organization. And so we're going to focus on the organization for a little bit. For NASSM, how do you as an organization embrace your responsibility as the voice of the field? How do you interrogate your practices or policies or even actions related to diversity, equity, and inclusion? For example, are there patterns or trends in who gets promoted to leadership positions in the organization? Are there patterns or trends in the type of scholarship that's being published in NASSM journals? For the diverse people in leadership or a part of the organization, have you inquired about their experiences in the organization? And most importantly, are you prepared to take action on what you learn? For individuals, how do we stop perpetuating the status quo in our own spheres of influence? First, having examined our own positionality and understanding the roles that history has played in where we are today, how then can we continue to call out bullying or microaggressions or stop behavior that we know is problematic? We know it's problematic because we've experienced it ourselves or because others have told us that this behavior is problematic. How do we cultivate co-conspirators? Bettina Love coined this label, and we can't stop the status quo alone. We need co-conspirators to help interrupt the norm or disrupt the norm. She says that a co-conspirator says, I know the terms. I know what white privilege and white supremacy mean. Now, what risks am I willing to take? It's saying, I'm going to put my privilege on the line for somebody. In what ways can NASSM socialize individuals to become co-conspirators? What programs or policies or organizational practices can support this particular transformation? What trainings can be put in place to teach individual members how to be agents of change in their spaces? Can you help support members learning in engaging with others or adopting or exploring different research approaches or paradigms or methodologies? What about retraining or training journal editors and editorial boards to broaden? We know that these individuals serve as gatekeepers to new knowledge, and they can also be instruments to maintain the status quo, or they can be instruments of supporting change.
If you consider your current role, how can you reimagine what could be done to address equity issues? Oftentimes, we equate resources to money, which isn't, you can't do this work without resources. And we all know money has power. But how do we capitalize on the human capital that each of us have? And really thinking about the human brilliance that we have within our own organizations, within our own colleges, within our own universities, right here in NASSM, and our own individual spheres of influence. How can our own communities reimagine structures of support that move us toward bold and transformative leadership? There are probably people that we work with daily that have ideas of how to do this in our own specific context. There are probably people right here in NASSM that have ideas as an organization of how it can be more bold, more transformative when we think about our approach to scholarship, our approach to transforming the field of sports management.
We need organizational leaders. We need individual faculty leaders who are willing to be creative and innovative, to help incentivize and create accountability to ensure that this work actually happens and it happens with urgency. One of the things that we know is that what gets measured counts, or what gets counted matters. What gets counted matters. So what are we counting as organizations? What are we counting in our departments? What are the measures for what are the measures for merit or for promotion? What are the measures for additional resources for our departments or colleges or institutions? How can we make sure that we are moving forward, that forward progress is actually happening? In what ways can we be creative about encouraging this forward movement to actually happen? And then holding others accountable. How can we create that standard and then hold others accountable to maintain that standard, especially if this is a part of what we say we desire to do? So as you as an organization, as you as individuals continue to race forward, to think about, we encourage you to embrace this journey and be willing to do the work towards becoming an agent of change. How can you create a better environment, not only for faculty of color, but for us all?
I want to thank you so much, Tamara and Cameron, for your thought-provoking keynote lecture and for sharing your expertise with the NASSM community. Clearly, there is much that we can do in our own workplaces to support the recruitment and retention of sport management faculty and students of color. And I hope many of the concepts discussed today can be applied by our NASSM members at their own universities. We are nearing the midpoint of the NASSM conference, but there are still plenty of special events remaining. I encourage all of you to join us today at 12:10 p.m. Central Time or 1:10 p.m. Eastern Time for the NASSM Student Research Award presentation. And then for the current members of NASSM out there, please note that our annual member meeting, the AGM, will be held today at 5:00 p.m. Central or 6:00 p.m. Eastern Time. And finally, members and non-members are welcome to join us tomorrow at 6:15 p.m. Central or 7:15 p.m. Eastern Time for the NASSM Founders Night, where we honor our award winners. Thanks so much for your presence today, and I hope to see many of you virtually as the conference continues.